The Beverly Hilton's Grand Ballroom buzzed with the familiar chaos of a major Hollywood press junket. Camera flashes popped like miniature lightning storms, and journalists shouted over each other, their voices merging into an indistinct roar. At the center of it all, seated behind a table draped in black cloth, was Adam Sandler. At 58, the comedian had maintained his signature disheveled charm. He wore his customary oversized t-shirt and basketball shorts, a fashion statement that had evolved from quirky to iconic over the decades. His latest film, a sci-fi comedy that blended his trademark humor with unexpected emotional depth, had just received a standing ovation at its premiere the night before. Critics were already calling it a late career renaissance. Next question. Please, called the moderator, a young publicist who'd been efficiently managing the room for the past 40 minutes. A small hand rose from the middle of the crowd. The publicist hesitated, clearly not expecting a child to be present among the sea of entertainment reporters, but Sandler leaned forward, squinting past the bright lights. "Yeah, the kid in the middle there," he said, pointing directly at a girl. No older than 12, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. The room quieted slightly. Curious about this unusual participant, the girl stood nervously, clutching a small notebook. The microphone reached her, and she cleared her throat before speaking in a clear voice that carried across the now hushed room. "Hi, Mr. Sandler. My name is Anna, and I'm in 6th grade. I'm writing for my school newspaper." She paused, gathering courage. "Everyone knows about your movies and jokes, but I wanted to ask, what's the most important thing being a dad? Has taught you that making people laugh hasn't?" The room fell completely silent. Celebrity journalists exchanged glances. This wasn't the usual question about upcoming projects or on-set anecdotes. The publicist started to intervene, but Sandler held up his hand, stopping her. He leaned back, in his chair, the usual mischievous glint in his eyes softening into something more reflective. For a moment, he seemed to forget the cameras, the critics, the entire promotional machinery surrounding him. "That's actually the best question I've gotten all day," he said, his voice shedding its performative energy. "Maybe the best one this whole press tour." He paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the punchline that didn't come. Instead, what followed was a rare moment of unguarded sincerity from a man who had built his career on making people laugh. Adam leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, his eyes fixed on Anna with an unusual intensity. The publicist glanced. At her watch, they were running behind schedule, but one look from Sandler and she backed down. "You know, when I first became a dad, I thought it would be like my movies, chaotic but ultimately funny, with everything working out in the end," he began, his voice taking on the gentle cadence he normally reserved for his more poignant film moments. "But being a father to Sadie and Sonny taught me something no comedy ever could, that love isn't just a feeling, it's a daily practice." A few journalists had lowered their recording devices, captivated by this unexpectedly earnest turn. Others typed frantically, sensing a rare, genuine moment from a star known for deflecting personal questions with humor. "I remember when Sadie was just a little thing, maybe 2 years old," he continued. "I was coming off a movie that didn't do so well. Critics hated it, audiences didn't show up. I was feeling pretty low, questioning everything. You know how it goes." He ran a hand through his curly hair, a gesture so familiar from his films that several people in the audience smiled automatically. "Anyway, I came home just defeated. And there was Sadie, just learning to talk. And she looks at me and says, 'Daddy, home,' with this pure joy like I was the greatest thing in the universe." He shook his head, smiling at the memory. And in that moment, I realized that to her, I wasn't a box office number or a Rotten Tomatoes score. I was just Dad, and that was everything. The room remained unusually quiet. Anna stood still, her notebook forgotten in her hands as she listened intently. That's when I understood something I try to remember every day. Success isn't measured by who laughs at your jokes or how much money you make. It's measured by who loves you when the laughter stops. Sandler paused, seeming almost surprised by his own candor. A veteran journalist in the front row nodded slowly, his pen hovering motionless above his notepad. So, to answer your question directly, Anna, being a dad taught me that the most meaningful connections in life aren't built on being funny or entertaining, but on being present. Really present. He leaned back in his chair, the vulnerability in his expression gradually giving way to his more familiar grin. Of course, being able to make chocolate pancakes in funny shapes still scores major dad points at my house, he added, the tension in the room breaking as scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. But the initial question had opened something up, and it was clear to everyone present that Sandler wasn't quite finished. The atmosphere in the ballroom had transformed. The initial frenzy, the competitive edge of journalists vying for sound bites, had mellowed into something resembling an intimate conversation. The publicist had stopped checking her watch, recognizing that something unusual and valuable was unfolding. You know what's funny? Sandler continued, his gaze still fixed on Anna, though he was clearly speaking to the entire room now. When my first daughter was born, everyone told me my life would change, and I'd nod and say, yeah, I know. But I had no idea. He laughed softly, shaking his head at his past self. I thought change meant less sleep and more responsibility. And it did mean those things, but that's like saying the ocean is wet. It's true, but it misses the whole point. A photographer at the side of the room lowered his camera, choosing instead to simply listen. The real change was that suddenly there was this small person who reflected everything back to me, my good habits and my bad ones. My girls watched how I treated people, how I reacted when things went wrong, how I spoke about others when they weren't around. Sandler's hands moved expressively as he spoke, punctuating his words with gestures that seemed less calculated than his usual comedic movements. I remember one time, Sunny, she was maybe 5, overheard me on the phone complaining about someone I'd worked with. Nothing terrible, just typical Hollywood stuff. After I hung up, she asked me why I was being mean about that person. Just a simple question, but man, it stopped me cold. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table, because she was right. I wasn't being my best self, and she called me on it with the perfect clarity that kids have. So I had to explain to her that sometimes grown-ups get frustrated and say things they shouldn't. And as I'm telling her this, I'm realizing I'm basically describing behavior I wouldn't want her to copy. Anna nodded, clearly connecting with his story. Several journalists had stopped typing altogether, simply absorbing the moment. That's the thing about parenthood that no one fully explains. Your kids make you want to be better, not just for them, but because of them. They make you examine parts of yourself you've been comfortable ignoring. He looked around the room, making eye contact with several people as if checking whether they understood. And let me tell you, that's way harder than making a room full of people laugh. Comedy comes naturally to me, being the kind of father my daughters deserve. That takes work every single day. A murmur of recognition passed through the audience, parents nodding, others reflecting on their own childhoods. But here's the beautiful part, Sandler said, his voice softening. It's the most worthwhile work I've ever done. Nothing else comes close. The publicist had long since abandoned any attempt to move the press conference along. Some journalists had put away their formal questions, drawn into the unexpected intimacy of the moment. Anna remained standing, her school newspaper assignment clearly yielding far more than she had anticipated. You know what's really wild? Sandler continued, settling into a rhythm that felt more like a heart-to-heart than a promotional event. How having kids changes your perspective on time. Before them, I measured time by projects, by films, by comedy tours. Now I measure it by these incredible milestones I get to witness. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine warmth. Sadie's first day of school, Sonny learning to ride a bike, their bat mitzvahs. He paused, his expression momentarily wistful. My oldest is in college now, which still doesn't compute in my brain sometimes. How did that happen? Several parents in the room nodded knowingly, that universal understanding of how quickly children grow. But the biggest lesson my daughters taught me is something I wish I'd learned earlier in life, Sandler said, his tone growing more reflective. They showed me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's actually the most courageous thing you can offer another person. He glanced down at his hands, then back at Anna. In comedy, you learn to use vulnerability as a tool. You show just enough of yourself to connect with an audience, but you keep a shield up. You control the narrative. No, but with your kids, that shield doesn't work. They see right through it. A few heads nodded in the back of the room. I remember one night I was going through a tough time professionally. A project I really cared about fell apart. I was trying to act like everything was fine at home, putting on the typical Sandler goofball routine at dinner. And Sadie, she was about 10 then, just looked at me and said, "Dad, are you sad about your movie?" He shook his head, still seeming surprised by the memory. Kids have this radar. They sense what you're feeling, even when you think you're hiding it perfectly. And in that moment, I had a choice. Brush it off with a joke or be honest with her. I chose to be honest, to tell her that yes, I was disappointed, and it was okay to feel that way sometimes. The room had grown so quiet that the distant sounds of the hotel lobby were audible. That conversation taught me something crucial about being both a parent and a human being. Real connection doesn't happen when we're performing or putting on a brave face. It happens in those vulnerable moments when we allow ourselves to be truly seen. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how far the conversation had drifted from the typical promotional banter. So to circle back to your question, Anna, what being a dad has taught me that comedy hasn't, is that our greatest impact on others doesn't come from entertaining them. It comes from showing them our authentic selves, flaws and all, and creating spaces where they feel safe to do the same. A profound silence had fallen over the grand ballroom. The usual rustling of papers, clicking of keyboards, and whispering among journalists had ceased entirely. For a moment, it seemed as though everyone present, from the veteran entertainment, reporters to the hotel staff hovering at the edges of the room, was collectively absorbing what they'd just witnessed. A genuine moment of humanity breaking through the polished veneer of celebrity promotion. Anna, still standing with her notebook, clutched to her chest, finally broke the silence. "Thank you, Mr. Sandler," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible on her face. "That was much better than what I expected." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the room, breaking the tension. Sandler grinned, his familiar, comedic energy returning. "Well, I hope your school newspaper has a good editor, because I just gave you way more material than will fit in one article," he quipped. As Anna took her seat, the moderator seemed unsure how to transition back to the scheduled program after such an unusually authentic interlude. Sensing her hesitation, Sandler leaned toward the microphone again. "Look, I know we're supposed to be talking about the movie here," he said, gesturing to the promotional poster behind him. "And it's a good movie, I'm proud of it. But what just happened feels important too." He surveyed the room, making eye contact with several journalists. "We spend so much time in these settings talking about projects and premieres and what's next, but sometimes the most valuable things get lost in all that noise. So thank you, Anna, for asking a question that matters beyond the entertainment cycle." The publicist, recognizing that this moment had evolved into something unexpectedly meaningful, nodded to Sandler, silently giving him the space to conclude his thoughts. "I've been doing this for a long time now," he said, his voice taking on a reflective quality again. "Made a lot of movies, told a lot of jokes. Some worked, some didn't. But at the end of the day, It's not the films or the fame that give my life meaning. It's sitting at the dinner table with my family, listening to my daughters talk about their days, watching them grow into these amazing young women. He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Jackie, my wife, and I often talk about how raising our girls has been the greatest creative collaboration of our lives. Better than any movie, funnier than any comedy special, more rewarding than any award. As he finished speaking, something unusual happened. Instead of the rush of follow-up questions that typically flood such events, the room remained quiet for several seconds, as if collectively honoring the authenticity of the moment. Then, slowly, the journalists began to applaud. It wasn't the perfunctory clapping that often concludes press events, but something more sincere, an acknowledgement that they had witnessed something rare and valuable. As the applause died down, the moderator stepped forward to resume the press conference. But something had fundamentally shifted. The questions that followed were more thoughtful, less focused on box office predictions and more on the human elements of Sandler's work. Later, as journalists filed out of the ballroom, many would remark that it was unlike any press event they'd covered, a reminder that beneath the celebrity machinery, beyond the promotional cycles, there exist genuine human connections waiting to be acknowledged. And Anna, the sixth-grade reporter whose simple question had sparked it all, left with not just material for her school newspaper, but with a lesson about the power of asking what truly matters. A lesson more valuable than any interview technique could provide. For Sandler, it was a reminder of what he'd expressed so eloquently, that our most meaningful impact comes not from our professional accomplishments, but from the authentic connections we forge when we allow ourselves to be truly seen.